Well, good morning everyone. It's about 8:15 right now, and this is Thursday morning. I woke up around 10 after 7 or so to rain falling, and as you can tell from what's around me, there's still actually a light mist falling, and it's pretty overcast out here. I think there's a good chance of rain most of the morning today from what the forecast was saying last night. So I think our plan is probably going to be to pack up and head out early. Really like the Nordhouse Dunes here. It's really scenic, and especially when you're camping out here, you're not very far from the lake. But the problem is when you're camping out here, you've got a 1.5 mile hike back towards the parking lot to pick up the trailheads to hit some of the trails. And especially with weather like this, when there's a chance of hitting this rain all day or rain all day, heading 1.5 miles out to get to the trails that are unmarked with no names and no mileage markers, and then having to hike back here 1.5 miles at the end of the day, or if it's raining, just didn't seem to work out this time. So like I said, we're probably gonna pack up early after breakfast and maybe head out. So, but overall, I really enjoyed the Nordhouse Dunes. I would come back here again. Alright, so that was the last video in the series. There were 5 of them. I decided to break it up into several different segments just so it wasn't too long to watch in one sitting. And one thing I realized when I was going over the videos and doing the editing and compiling everything, I noticed there were a couple videos where I said things on the trail on the spur of the moment without actually thinking, and they came out maybe a little bit incorrect or not quite accurate. And there were a couple times when I wanted to say things and I didn't. So I figured I'd use this opportunity to go back and maybe explain some things that weren't quite clear, and also mention things that I think maybe would be important if you guys decide to visit the trail. Okay, so the first thing is the Manistee River Trail loop hike. I mentioned in the video it was 21 to 23 miles long. Okay, so how long is it? I personally have never used a GPS to record the distance on the trip, and from some of the websites I've seen online, I've seen 21 miles and I've seen 23 miles. So how long it is, I don't know, but it's roughly within that ballpark. Okay, second thing. If you're going to make a trip out there and you're going to start from where we did there at Red Bridge, one thing you need to know for sure is where to park. When I did the loop a couple years ago with my son, we got in at late at night and I missed the first parking lot, and we parked on the side west of the river by the boat launch. And it wasn't until we came back and finished our loop and we had our stuff in the car getting ready to leave, we saw one of the rangers come through, and he was talking to some people, and we were overhearing the conversation, and he mentioned something about being upset that people were parking by the boat launch to do their trip on the Manistee River Trail, and that they can be ticketed for that. And he was upset that people weren't parking on the east side of the river in the parking lot there. So if you do go and hike the trail and you start from the Red Bridge access point, make sure you park in the lot on the east side of the river and not the west side. Otherwise you're going to risk getting a ticket. Okay, so the next thing is, like I mentioned in the video, the trail is really not all that demanding. It was a little rough at times for us because it was so hot and very humid, but in terms of the trail itself, it really wasn't bad. The one thing to keep in mind though is on the Manistee River side, you do have access to water, but on the North Country Trail side, we had water when we left at Red Bridge, and then when we stopped up near Eddington Creek, and then any point in between, the access to water really isn't there. You're quite a ways from the river. Most places we couldn't even really see the river, so trying to get water from down at the Manistee River, probably not going to work for you, and in between there's no places to resupply any water. So while there are additional campsites from when I was there before with my son on the North Country Trail side, which is a nice thing, you're gonna have to make sure you pack in enough water to get yourself through the rest of the night, and then for breakfast in the morning, cleaning dishes and that kind of stuff, because the only place to get it, like I said, was at Red Bridge or up at Eddington Creek. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Okay, so the next thing that I want to clarify that I said in one of the videos, actually I think it was the second video, it was about 13 minutes in, and we were standing on a bluff overlooking the river at one of the campsites, and I made mention that it would have been a nice place to stay, however there was no way to get water. And while that was partially true, if you were staying at that site and you wanted to get water, you just have to backtrack down the trail about a 5-10 minute walk, and you'd have been down at the river bank by some of the other campsites there. So not a big deal, but kind of wanted to clarify that because I made mention that it wasn't a good place to camp because there was no water, which was true, but not really. Okay, so one of the other things I mentioned in one of the videos was the fact that there were mile markers on the Manistee River Trail side. Again, that was partially true and partially not true. Let me explain. Every so often along the trail, they actually had a map of the Manistee River Trail section posted on either a signpost or somewhere near a parking area, and it depicted where the various campsites were, and it had some mile markers on the map. On the trail, however, there are no mile markers, so it is true that you have some idea in terms of where you're at in terms of mileage if you look at one of those maps, but unlike some of the other trails I've been on, there are no mile markers directly on the trail for you, so you kind of have to take your bearings from a map and figure it out from there. Okay, so let's move on to the Nordhouse Dunes now. Interesting fact about the Nordhouse Dunes is that it's a national wilderness area, and it's actually within the boundaries of the Manistee National Forest. It's also home to the federally endangered piping plover, which is a bird, as well as the pitcher's thistle. The park encompasses about 3,450 acres, and it has 4 major trails for a total distance of about 11 miles. As well as a couple other small sections of trail. Now, the one thing you need to keep in mind if you do decide to visit the Nordhouse Dunes, especially if you plan to hit the trails, in keeping with the National Wilderness Area, they have decided not to permanently mark any of the trails or name them officially. So when you go there, it's probably best if you get a copy of a map, which is pretty rudimentary, have it with you when you hit the trails. Because really the only way to navigate without mileage markers or posts or trail markers is kind of to look at the map, follow the path that you're on, and then when you reach an intersection, look at your map and see if you can figure out what intersection you're at, and then make your turns from there. So I will also put a link to that map down below, and you can find that link there and just download the map before you go. It's also got some descriptions of the trails there, which is kind of helpful. Okay, now if you watched all the videos, you'll realize that while we were at the Nordhouse Dunes, we didn't really do very much hiking. The one day I think we maybe hiked 1.5 miles or 2 miles, and that was all basically through the dunes and then back along the shoreline. From where we were camped, the trails were about 1 mile or 1.5 miles back towards the parking lot. And with the weather being as uncooperative it was, we didn't want to be too far away with cameras and all of our gear. Obviously, if we had been on a regular trail and we had to keep moving, we would just dealt with it and kept everything covered up. But we'd already done our hiking, and it was kind of a nice area, so we chose to just lounge around when it wasn't raining and see some of the sites locally right there around our campsite. Okay, so what else can you do there at Nordhouse Dunes besides lounging around and camp or hanging out at the beach swimming? Well, one of the things you could do that we didn't do is you could actually hit the shoreline and hike south about 5 or 6 miles, and what that'll do is it'll get you down into Ludington State Park, and one of the main attractions down there in the park is the Big Sable Point Lighthouse. They've actually got tours. You can actually hike up to the top. They've got people there who manage the lighthouse, and you can learn about the local history there and the history of the lighthouse, which is interesting, but that's something we didn't do. Okay, so to wrap this segment up, I guess the bottom line is, would I do these trails again? And the answer is yes on both accounts. If you watched the very first segment, you realized that I mentioned hiking the Manistee River Loop hike once before with my son, And then obviously we did it again this time. So would I do it a third time? Absolutely. Alright, and then the Nordhouse Dunes, I would do that one again as well. Like I said, I wouldn't make it a destination, but I'd try to include it at the beginning or end of another hike like what we did with this one, because there's just not a ton of stuff to do and there's not enough trails to keep you busy for 4 or 5 days. But if you're interested in hiking back and hitting the 11 miles of trails up near, not far from the parking lot, or to hike the shoreline south to the Ludington State Park and visit the Big Sable Point Lighthouse, that'd be something to do too. Okay, so hopefully all that information helped you out. Hopefully you enjoyed all the other videos, and stick around to see what comes up in the future.